project was World War I's Ignorance in America and the True Implications on the World. So, my objective in this project was to explore how and why this war is overlooked in the American classroom, and why it should be a more integral part of our curriculum due to its contemporary applications that it has. So, first thing is to say, you can always say something, we don't study this topic, we don't go over it, but, that's just a statement. So you need to provide some foundation to it. So, what I did was, I looked into the textbooks. Here I have analyzed the textbooks from Texas, California, and Florida, which are the three out of the 4 top textbook buying states in the U.S. So what these states buy, the rest of the country adopts their curriculum. And then also I analyzed the AP World History Review book, and as you can see, orange represents World War II, which I use as a reference. It's the only other World War to occur. And blue represents World War I. And in each book, there is a discrepancy between how much focus is given to World War I compared to World War II. Now, I went on and I did a survey here in my school, to make sure that it was not just maybe the textbooks aren't providing the amount of pages it needs, but they're giving the right information. So I asked pretty basic questions about the war, something that if someone had a good knowledge about it, they'd be able to understand. But as you can clearly see, the red area signifies the correct answer. Out of these 3 questions, only one got over 57%, got 57%, over 50, and that was in what years of World War I occurred. And even with that, if you take a look at the note down there, in an article that I referenced by Mackenzie Carpenter, 2008 survey by the Common Core that they handed out to the students in the states that adopted Common Core, only 40% of students were able to answer correctly between what years in 1900 through 1950 World War I occurred. And also she goes on to talk about a student that was attending Yale at the time. She wrote the article in 2014 that he came from a high school that stresses history education, and he went to college knowing only cliches about the war, not having a full understanding about it. And then here I have the last 2 questions, and out of these 2, only the treaty that ended the war gets over 50% again. So it's clear that, there is an understanding here, even in this school, which stresses, a very well-rounded education, focus on AP classes, and tries to give students an understanding of everything around. Now, I broke it down for the 3 questions that got the most incorrect answers to see if maybe it was something that one grade was getting it wrong and others that maybe had the understanding were getting it right. But clearly, the only one that gets over 50% is question 2 for 11th graders. Everything else, there's no understanding about it. Students don't know what this war is about, what are the specifics of it. So, when I was doing my research, I came up with 3 reasons for why maybe this is occurring. So, time that has passed since the war began, the lack of media portraying the war, and also the small American role that they took in the war. So, time since the war. Next year, on November 11th, marked the 100th anniversary of when World War I ended. It started over 100 years ago. The last survivor passed away in February of 2012. So that doesn't really give a strong connection to the war. But, as it says here, many historical events that influence our world today happened long before World War I. And if that's the case, why would we even study history? Why look back into the past if we're not going to look at something that happened 100 years ago? There are many things that happened. So, lack of media. Again, even though this took place during the innovation years, after industrialization, the technology wasn't there. You could get pictures, but there's not much video about the war. And again, that doesn't give that connection, doesn't put you in the middle of the battlefield at, say, World War II videos, or videos from Vietnam. So, that doesn't really give that connection again. There's not that, oh, I can see myself there, see the horror of it. But again, back to previous events. There are other things that happen in history, other wars, that didn't have videos, that were limited to only pictures, maybe even paintings. And we go over that because it influences us today. So again, you don't want to go over something that doesn't have video, happened long ago. Why go over history in general? Now, the reason that had the most reasons behind it, that had the foundation for it, was the small American role. We didn't get involved in the war until 1917. And even with that, we were reluctant to get in. We didn't want to get involved. We didn't undertake a significant role in the fighting. It was the British and the French that took the brunt of it against the Germans. And we didn't want to get involved in the fallout. Even though President Woodrow Wilson came up with the idea for the League of Nations, Congress voted down joining it. We wanted to let Europe deal with its problems, and we were still holding on to Washington's farewell address saying, let Europe deal with their problems, We deal with ours. We don't want to get involved in that continent. And now another thing is there's no image of American glory. Morning. Good.
This is Dr. Giannis. He's another reviewer. He's been stuck in horrible traffic today.
I'm sorry to
okay.
interrupt you, Anthony,
It's
but
okay.
I know that he's already reviewed your project, so I didn't want him to miss out on sitting
Okay.
in on what he could.
Good morning.
Hi.
So, back to what I was saying. No image of American glory. Now, as you can see here, other wars where the U.S. was involved, there's that one quintessential picture that everyone remembers. You know, Washington crossing the Delaware, Lee surrendering to Grant, the Marines on Iwo Jima, taking down Saddam Hussein's statue. There's that one image that puts America on the pedestal. You know, our troops in their finest hour. World War I didn't have that. You know, the happiest picture would be this one right here. This were the American doughboys, is what they were called, when they first entered the war. You know, very hyper, ready to get into the battle. But clearly, as you can see, you know, most of the other pictures are very grim pictures. You know, getting into trenches, which trench warfare was horrendous. You know, in hollowed out battlefields, burying soldiers. This wasn't a very romantic war. It was very grim, dark, sad. It was a terrible time. Now, I've established that there is some foundation to why we're overlooking this, but why should we study this topic? What really is the reason why? So, these are some of the implications that this war had. A new type of warfare was adopted. As I said, you know, happened after the years of industrialization, machinery improved the way weapons were made, how fast they were made, led to the beginning of the Russian Revolution, and also it led to the destabilization of the Middle East by creating the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So, the horrors of mechanized warfare. During this time, machine guns, tanks, airplanes, airships, they made their first appearances on the battlefield. And this changed the way war was fought. You know, also artillery took a bigger role because of how fast they could make the shells, how accurate they were. They caused 70% of battle casualties. As you can see down here with this animation, how fast the machine guns could shoot. Now imagine having a single shot carbine rifle where you have to pull back the lever to reload it, and you have a machine gun that you feed a belt in and it's constantly firing. You know, that leads to a lot of death. For the artillery, in the Kaiserslaut, known as the Kaiser's Battle, is what it says in German, where the spring offensives of 1918, over 1 million rounds were fired in a span of 5 hours. You know, and chemical warfare made its first appearance here. 110,000 tons were used. And then here are the numbers for what this war created. 65 million men from over 40 countries fought in World War I. Of that, about 8 million were killed. That's 6,000 for every day of the war. 21.2 million were injured. And then under here we have over 8 million civilian casualties. That was another type of warfare that was adopted during this time. Total warfare. Nobody was left out. You know, artillery took out towns, cities, and if there were civilians in the way, there were civilians in the way. There was no respect, sort of, if you could say there's respect in the war. And then now, this was, I think, has the heaviest hit. Pilot down there, young British man, wants to join his Air Force, defend his country, fight for his country. He had about 40 to 60 hours to live. 2 days. You know. And then Ernest Hemingway, very great author, referred to it as the lost generation. Because everyone that came to grow up during that time, either they lost loved ones in the war, lost their lives in the war, or were somehow affected by the war, and they couldn't really adjust to it because it was something they had never seen before. Now, the origins of the Russian-Soviet threat. The years leading up to the war, the situation in Russia wasn't very good. Sentiments toward the Tsar had turned sour. There was mistrust in the government, there was corruption, and the involvement of Russia in World War I and its disaster in the Russo-Japanese War were finally pushed. The Russo-Japanese War happened in 1905, or it ended in 1905. The Russians lost. That started to create that unrest in Russia. They didn't believe the government was strong anymore. And then after the Russians crashed out of World War I with not only the highest military casualties, but the highest civilian casualties, it all exploded. You know, February 1917, revolution begins. By October of the same year, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party take control of the government buildings. They start instilling the Marxist government. Now, the country they created, we know it as the Soviet Union. Now, we have a clear direct influence from that. 90 miles to the south, Cuba. turned communist by the Russians. You know, many other countries were turned communist by the Russians. We fought proxy wars. We still do that today. An example, Syria. It's a proxy war going on there between the Russians and the Americans. And even with that, there's still remnants of that Soviet presence in Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin was the head of the KGB before. And, you know, it started the Cold War. The Cold War was the period of time where people would wake up and not know if the US and the Russians would start throwing nuclear missiles at each other. And they lived in that constant fear. And this all was started in World War I, from the Russians crashing out and civil unrest finally turning into a revolution. Now, this is a map of the Ottoman Empire during World War I and before World War I. Now, you can see it covers Libya, parts of Egypt, Sudan, Yemen, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and even parts of Iran. Now, Iraq and Iran were President George Bush Jr. He called part of the axis of evil. And that is due to, you know, Iran having anger towards the US and terrorism building up in the region. And even in Yemen, Egypt, Sudan, we see terrorism spark. So, the Ottoman Empire was considered the biggest enemy to Europe, you know, the brown man threat. They were the only power that could truly challenge the Europeans and throw their empires away. So when World War I broke out, British used it as an advantage to not only take the oil that they held in that region, but to take out that threat. So what that led was to a whole slew of problems coming out of it. The Ottoman government wasn't the best government there, very cruel, you know, ruled with an iron fist, if you want to say it like that. And taking it out just let the tribal rivalries, the religious differences, they came to light. And also, it was the impotence of the British, the French, the Russians going in there and trying to instill their values, their type of government on that region. Someone who doesn't speak the language you speak, doesn't have the same customs, doesn't look like you. They come and they tell you, you have to follow my way of government, my rules, because I said so. Doesn't really appeal to anyone. You wouldn't want to follow it. So that led to strong, angry sentiments against the West. You know, terrorism built up. We instilled dictators in the region with Saddam Hussein, who the U.S. put in power and then had to take out because he was going against U.S. interests. And it was just a disaster. And we still see it today with the U.S. trying to get involved in Middle Eastern affairs. And they don't like us, you know, terrorism, ISIS, you know, going against the West, you know, and the traditional powers that started it. France, Britain, the U.S. So it's something that's directly related to taking out the Ottoman Empire in World War I and having all these differences, all these rivalries, and this strong sentiment that built up against the West began because of the fallout of this war. Now, why do we need this knowledge? Well, one thing is to learn from the past. You need to know what was done before in order to not make the same mistakes again today. You know, students need to be able to connect the dots in a way, you know, be able to say, okay, this problem we have today, we can trace it back to here. You know, what did we do back then that led to this starting? What can we do differently? And as the famous saying by George Santayana goes, those who do not know the past are condemned to repeat it. And that is something that we really do not want. We don't want to start more problems. We don't want to repeat what we did before and have the same thing happen again, maybe in a different way, but still. Do we want to start another religious war? Do we want to start another Cold War? We need to learn from those past mistakes and use that knowledge today in order to improve the world. So, the war to end all wars, as World War I is commonly referred to, is being ignored in the U.S. Textbooks aren't going over it enough. Students don't have that knowledge of the topic, and we need to learn from it. You know, the education system is trying to promote American exceptionalism. You know, wars in where we were the powerhouse, we were the heroes that put us on a pedestal, and it's going over one of history's most important occurrences, something that we need to learn from. Because as Ivan Elan, he said in an article once that World War I was what led to World War II. World War I is what led to a lot of problems we have today. So out of the two world wars, it's the most important. So we need to emphasize this. We need to make sure students are understanding this, whether it be through history education, English by going over literature of the time, art history, going over painters in that time, how their art showed how lost they were, geography, how it changed the politics of the region, how it changed population trends. So it's many different ways that we can go over this to make sure that our students understand this, have a great knowledge of it, and can use that knowledge to not only change the world today, but in the future. Now these are the references that I used for the PowerPoint and the paper, and that is my presentation.